This lecture is about the respiratory system. So let's start off by talking about the functions of this system. And so basically, it's going to transport gases to and from the body. We have to be able to take in oxygen, and we have to be able to release carbon dioxide. And so respiration is often broken up into two categories. External respiration, which is taking in oxygen from the atmosphere and transferring it to the blood, and then taking gases out of the blood and bringing them back to the atmosphere. And then there's internal respiration, which is the gas moving from the blood to the tissues, in the case of oxygen, and also gases being released from tissues like carbon dioxide, which is waste product, and going back to the blood so that it can be carried to the lungs, which in humans we have lungs, and a lot of this lecture is going to be talking about the lungs. But realize that other animals, such as aquatic animals, have gills. And so in the case of gills, the water is going to be passed over the gills, and then the gills extract oxygen from the water. And then birds, on the other hand, have air sacs. And the air sacs allow them to take in more oxygen and store more oxygen during flight. So let's talk about the human respiratory system. And first we're going to go over the anatomy and the flow of air into the lungs, how it gets to where it's going. And so I'm going to draw a rudimentary picture of a human being. There's the hair. And we will put in a respiratory system shortly. So oxygen is going to enter through the nasal cavity and then go down into the pharynx, which is the throat, and then enter down into the trachea. And we'll label all these parts in just a minute. The trachea branches off into two bronchi, which lead to the lungs. And so the lungs are in the thoracic cavity, and just inferior to the thoracic cavity, we have the diaphragm muscle. And there is the heart, though the heart is not part of the respiratory system. Okay, so we have the nasal cavity. Air goes in the nasal cavity, which is the nose, so going in through the nostrils. And then air will go down into the pharynx, which is another word for throat. And then air will pass into the larynx, which is the voice box, but first passing by the epiglottis, which is tissue that we will talk about shortly, and through the larynx, which is otherwise known as the voice box. And the larynx is sort of the gateway to the trachea, which is the windpipe. The trachea branches off into two bronchi. Singular is bronchus, but there are two of them, so bronchi, plural. And the bronchi lead to the lungs. And then just inferior to the lungs, or to the thoracic cavity, we have the diaphragm muscle that controls breathing, and we'll talk all about that. And so realize, looking at this picture, let's go through it again. Air enters the nasal cavity, goes down into the pharynx, and then from the pharynx goes past the epiglottis and into the larynx. And the epiglottis is actually a fold of tissue that's going to cover the larynx when you swallow so that food doesn't go down in. So make sure that food gets to the stomach esophagus and then stomach instead of down into the larynx and further down into the lungs. Okay, so air is going from the pharynx to the larynx and then down into the trachea and then down into the bronchi and then into the lungs. And we will look at the anatomy of the lungs shortly. Just for some perspective on this system, let's look at some other parts of the body that are in these same locations, such as the heart, which is part of the circulatory system or cardiovascular system. It is not part of the respiratory system, but it does sit over to the left side. And as a result of that, the left lung is smaller than the right lung. The right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has only 2 lobes. Okay, and then just to look at other parts of the body, you have the esophagus here. And the esophagus is behind or posterior to the trachea. And the esophagus is the food tube that is going to lead from the pharynx down into the stomach, which I'm attempting to draw. So we have the esophagus carries food down into the stomach. Okay, so these blue parts are not part of the respiratory system, but it just to give you some idea of the overall anatomy of this area of the body. Okay, so realize that the trachea is anterior to the esophagus. So if you touch your throat, or your neck, I should say, you can feel some hardness, and that is the trachea, which is covered by hard cartilage, which protects the trachea and prevents it from collapsing. Let's take a look on the next slide at the anatomy of the lungs and also some aspects of their function. Okay, so the lungs are the sites of gas exchange. This is where the gas comes out of the blood and goes into the blood. Oxygen going into blood vessels, carbon dioxide coming out of blood vessels. And so if we just look at a picture of the lung, let's draw that. And air is going to enter into a lung through the bronchus. And the bronchus branches off into smaller tubes, which are called bronchioles. And bronchioles lead to the air sacs, which are known as the alveoli. And alveoli are clusters of air sacs. And the alveoli is where the gas exchange occurs. So air goes all the way down into the alveoli, but the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries, which I'm attempting to draw in red and blue. Remember, capillaries are the smallest blood vessels, and this is where substances are exchanged. And so the oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the capillaries, and the carbon dioxide is going to come from the capillaries into the alveoli so that it can be exhaled. And let's take a close-up look of an air sac. And so air sacs are surrounded by a single layer of flattened cells, actually called simple squamous epithelial cells, but you don't need to know that. I'm drawing these flattened cells, they're the nuclei, and they're in a single layer because gases have to pass back and forth by diffusion. And so remember that diffusion is flowing down a concentration gradient. Okay, so I'm drawing a capillary around the air sac because each air sac is surrounded by a capillary, or more than one capillary. And so oxygen is going to go from the air sac into the capillary, and carbon dioxide is coming out. When oxygen goes into the capillary, it's going to go in by diffusion. It diffuses into the capillary. So just a reminder of what diffusion is. Diffusion is when a substance moves down its concentration gradient. So there's more oxygen in the air sac than in the capillary, so it will move down its concentration gradient into the capillary. And then the opposite is going to happen with carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide diffuses from the capillary into the air sac because the carbon dioxide is higher in the capillary. It's been released from the tissues and carried by the blood to the lung. And so the carbon dioxide is higher in the capillary than in the air sac, and carbon dioxide diffuses into the air sac. And so the oxygen turns the blood red when it binds to hemoglobin, but the blood coming in the capillary from the body is still blue. Okay, so oxygen is going to go into the bloodstream, and let's take a look at that. Oxygen goes from the air sac and diffuses into the bloodstream where it goes into red blood cells where it's bound to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a large protein with 4 subunits, 2 alpha subunits, alpha 1 and alpha 2, and 2 beta subunits. And each of these proteins that are bound together, they each have a molecule of heme. Okay, and heme is not a protein, but it is sitting in the protein of hemoglobin. And there are 4 hemes per hemoglobin. Heme contains iron, and it is the iron that the oxygen is going to bind to. And so each hemoglobin molecule, which is made up of 4 subunits, can bind to 4 molecules of oxygen. Okay, so each hemoglobin binds to 4 oxygen molecules, and the oxygen must bind to iron in each heme. Okay, so if you are low in iron in your diet, you cannot make heme or red blood cells. Remember, this is all happening in red blood cells. And therefore, you cannot transport oxygen. And you have what is called anemia. And so the treatment for anemia is to take more iron into your diet, either by taking a pill containing iron or by eating dark green leafy vegetables, and also liver has a lot of iron in it. And remember that if you are anemic, then you're probably going to have low energy. And the reason for that is that oxygen is required for our bodies to make ATP. Remember, oxygen is the ultimate electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. And if your cells don't have enough of it, then you can't make very much ATP. Okay, let's look at what happens with carbon dioxide in the blood. So carbon dioxide is going to come from cells. It is going to be coming from cells from the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria. And 25% of the carbon dioxide that comes out of cells binds to hemoglobin. And this should actually say hemoglobin here, because carbon dioxide actually doesn't compete with oxygen's binding to the heme. So just remember that carbon dioxide can bind to the amino acids of hemoglobin. Okay, and then about 67% of the carbon dioxide that comes out of cells is going to combine with water. And then in that reaction, carbonic acid is going to form, which can then dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And so what happens is that carbon dioxide is actually carried in the blood as carbonic acid, and also dissociates into hydrogen ion, which is an acid. And so too much carbon dioxide then makes the blood more acidic. And so it's actually the reason that people die from suffocation is primarily because they can't get rid of their carbon dioxide and their blood becomes too acid, rather than that they can't get enough oxygen. And so it's very important that we get rid of our carbon dioxide through exhaling to maintain the pH of the blood. So 67% of the carbon dioxide is going to travel in this way in the blood. And then these reactions are reversible. So when carbon dioxide arrives at the lungs, then the carbonic acid can be converted back into carbon dioxide gas and exhaled out of the body. And then just about 8% of the carbon dioxide is going to dissolve in blood. Let's take a look at the parts of the respiratory system again, because we're going to go over some other features of the system. And so, for example, the epiglottis, the larynx, which is the voice box, and the trachea, and the bronchi. Let's take a look at those parts of the respiratory system. Okay, so this slide is about the epiglottis and the larynx. And the epiglottis is a piece of tissue, part of tissue that is going to close when you swallow, and it closes over the larynx. Epi means over, and the glottis is the opening in the larynx. And the purpose then is to obviously prevent food from going down into the wrong passageway. Prevent food from going down into the trachea. Food is supposed to go from the esophagus to the stomach. And the larynx then is the voice box, okay? And it contains folds of tissue that are called the vocal cords. And sound is created when air is forced out of the lungs and passes through the vocal cords, causing them to vibrate. Pitch is created when the muscles that are surrounding the vocal cords cause an alteration in the length of the cords. And you know that you can manipulate the pitch of your voice by the muscle tension that you place on the larynx. Men, for example, have lower voices than women because they have naturally longer vocal cords. And then words are basically formed by the tongue and the mouth and the lips. So the muscles of those areas of the body are what cause words to form. But of course, the ability to form words at all and to produce language is a function of an area of the brain called the cerebral cortex. Let's talk about the trachea and the bronchi on the next slide, which are air passages that are going to lead into the lungs. So air passes from the larynx to the trachea to the bronchi, and from the bronchi goes into the lungs. Trachea is about 12 inches long, branches off into two bronchi, and the bronchi lead to smaller tubes called the bronchioles. And let's draw the bronchioles. And all of these air passages are lined with special cells that are ciliated, meaning they have cilia or hairs that project from the plasma membrane. And those cilia then function to trap particulate matter from the air. There's a picture of a ciliated epithelial cell. They trap particles so that those particles don't go down into your lungs. And the ciliated epithelial cells are surrounded by these mucus-secreting cells. And the mucus is a gooey fluid that also has the effect of trapping particulate matter so that it doesn't get down into the lungs. And then we sneeze or blow our nose, and that particulate matter comes out with the mucus. And the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles do not participate in gas exchange, though. They are bringing gas into the lungs, certainly, and there are tubes where gas is then transported out of the lungs. But gas does not diffuse from the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles directly into the capillaries. That only happens in the air sacs. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about how breathing happens. How is it that air moves into the chest cavity and moves out of the chest cavity? Okay, so how does breathing happen? Just a little terminology. Breathing in is called inspiration, what we call inhalation. Air goes in. And expiration is the opposite. Exhalation, air moves out. And basically, it's mainly controlled by the diaphragm muscle. Also, a lot of the muscles that are surrounding the ribs are involved in breathing. And so let's just draw the lungs, the air passages and the lungs. And underneath, so this is the thoracic cavity. Underneath the thoracic cavity is the diaphragm muscle, which has this kind of arc shape in its relaxed state. So this is its normal position when it is relaxed, at rest. And so after you expire or exhale your carbon dioxide, the diaphragm is going to look like this. But when the diaphragm contracts, that's an active process, and the contraction of the diaphragm, let's draw my little picture again. The contraction of the diaphragm is going to cause this muscle to flatten. And when it flattens, it's going to create a lot more space in the thoracic cavity. And so the more space that you have in the thoracic cavity, the more volume you have. And volume is inversely proportional to pressure. Okay, so you actually have lower pressure in the thoracic cavity and air goes in, which is called inspiration. So the diaphragm flattens, that creates more volume in the thoracic cavity. Air flows in from the outside, and that's called inspiration. So why does that happen? Okay, so basically what you have to realize is that air is going to flow down their pressure gradient. Okay, gases in the air are going to flow down their pressure gradients. Okay, so they're going to go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And so what's going to happen is that at resting outside, you have atmospheric pressure, which is measured at 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, this is the ability of air to cause mercury to climb up a tube. Okay, what is the pressure of that? Well, it's about 760 millimeters, okay, which is 7.6 centimeters. That is how high mercury will climb in a tube, okay? And when your lungs are at rest, the atmospheric pressure outside is identical to the atmospheric pressure inside the thoracic cavity, which is also 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and then when your diaphragm contracts, of course, atmospheric pressure is still the same outside, but on the other hand, there's a greater volume in the thoracic cavity. And so volume is inversely proportional to pressure. And so what's going to happen is there's a lower pressure inside the thoracic cavity. Let's make it 758 millimeters of mercury. And then the air is going to flow down its pressure gradient and go in from the outside. Okay, and that is what we call inspiration or inhalation. So that the diaphragm flattens, that's an active process. And in expiration, the diaphragm relaxes, and that is a passive process. Okay, so we say that's all controlled by the diaphragm muscle. But in actual fact, something is controlling the diaphragm muscle. And so what controls the diaphragm muscle is going to be the brain. And so let's just take a look at a picture of the brain. So we have a person's head here. And their thoracic cavity with the lungs and air passages. And here we have the brain. And the brain has the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem is the base of the brain, and it is actually the most primitive part of our brain, controlling all sorts of functions that happen automatically without our conscious control. And the brainstem is always sending electrical impulses, nervous impulses to the diaphragm muscle. We can see that in the picture here. And normally that's going to happen with a regular repeating pattern, a normal rhythmicity. But of course, when you exercise, your diaphragm is going to move faster because you need to get rid of your carbon dioxide. And that's because there are carbon dioxide sensors in blood vessels. And so when your carbon dioxide levels go up because your Krebs cycle is working harder, then the sensors in the blood vessel send a message to the brainstem, and the brainstem sends messages that speed up the rate of diaphragm contraction. And of course, when you relax, this situation is reversed by the lowered carbon dioxide levels in your blood. This is, of course, automatic, but as we all know, you can hold your breath, so you can control it. But it's still automatic, because if you hold your breath for too long, what's going to happen is you're going to pass out, and then once again, breathing resumes. So you can only control it for a short period of time. And that ends our lecture on the respiratory system. Thank you for listening.